Fans knew Episode 3 would diverge from the game in a big way, but they weren't ready for the beautifully tragic love story of Bill and Frank. The episode also foreshadowed Joel and Ellie's journey through the rest of the series. There's a lot to unpack there, so let's start with Bill and Frank. The hype leading up to the episode was unreal. All the fans on Twitter were excited about how the next episode's gonna be the Bill and Frank episode. I knew that the series had to diverge from the game at some point to streamline events.
Man, that was close. Thanks for the heroics and all.
But I had no idea that I was getting a Bill and Frank love story that spanned 16 years. And honestly, I was weeping by the end. The image of Joel and Ellie driving away, the camera slowly backing into Bill and Frank's room, the window kept open just like Bill wrote in his letter. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative that also served to move the plot forward. But there were a lot of unanswered questions and a very obvious Chekhov's gun right near the episode's end.
What's your name? Bill. Go take a shower, Bill.
The first question on everyone's mind is about Frank. What did he suffer from? Well, when I first saw him sitting in a wheelchair and struggling to use a paintbrush, I immediately thought it was ALS. Frank has trouble breathing. His muscles are either extremely weak or partially paralyzed, and his condition also makes it difficult for him to eat food. It has to be ALS, right? Well, it could be. In the Last of Us podcast, Craig Mazin spoke about how they didn't want to reveal whether Frank had MS or early ALS. Instead of telling the audience through dialogue, Mazin and director Peter Hoare chose to show the decline of Frank's health through his movements, emotions, and bodily restrictions. The only piece of information we're given by Frank is when he says that there's no cure for it. But if you ask me, I'd say it's ALS. In case you didn't know, ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that affects the nerve cells in the brain and spine. It causes muscle weakness that leads to paralysis and then eventually death. From what we saw in the episode, Frank was in the early to mid stages of ALS, and it was devastating to watch, especially when he asked Bill to help him die. The reason why I think it's ALS is because it's generally more fatal than MS. The average life expectancy of someone suffering from ALS is just 2 to 5 years from the time it's diagnosed. On the other hand, MS is not usually fatal, and people who suffer from it can live several decades depending on how their bodies react to it.
With ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, it's already nearly robbed him of his ability to walk and his ability to speak.
So for me, Frank suffering from ALS and deciding that it's he who decides when he'll die is that much more meaningful. And this also brings us to the two biggest changes from the game. In the game, Bill and Frank have a big fight, and Frank leaves the compound, only to get bitten by a horde of infected. And he doesn't want to be turned into a mindless zombie by the cordyceps infection, so he decides to end his life on his own terms and hangs himself. Bill, on the other hand, is the only one left surviving and keeps defending his town from bandits and zombies. I gotta admit, it was bold of Mazin and Neil Druckmann to switch up Bill and Frank like that, and it worked. Not only were the changes welcomed by the game's fan base and general audiences, I'd argue that it was better than the game.
And I'm fixing up some of the shops.
Whoa.
Not the ones, just the wine shop and the furniture store. And the clothing boutique.
The boutique.
Where players only spent a few moments with Bill before Joel and Ellie had to leave Lincoln. The episode was a cinematic masterpiece, from their first lunch together to the strawberry scene, and finally their last perfect day. And here I was thinking that Bill was going to kick the bucket when the bandits showed up at their compound. In my head I was like, no, you can't leave Frank alone with his little pistol like this. He won't last a week. But you know what? Druckmann was right. That was the happiest episode in the series. He tweeted that the day after it aired, and I know he was messing around, but he's right. That's the most peaceful end to anyone's story in the Last of Us universe I've ever seen.
You wanna...
Go ahead, you do it.
August 29, 2023.
Remember Riley from Left Behind? Or Tess? Or Sam and Henry? Or literally anyone else from the game? The fact that Mason and Druckmann gave Bill and Frank a quiet death in each other's arms is unlike anything the Last of Us universe has seen. If you think about it, their story doesn't end tragically at all. It's a happy ending in a dark, messed up world, but that's the only happy ending you're gonna get in this series, because the rest of it isn't going to be so heartwarming. Let's talk about the Chekhov's gun I mentioned earlier, or more specific, Frank's pistol. Ellie finds it while searching the house and hides it in her backpack. This is some obvious foreshadowing for what's about to come next. She has a gun. She's obviously going to use it. Now in the game, Joel gave her the gun voluntarily and told her to only use it in emergencies. This happens when the two of them travel to Pittsburgh and she uses the gun for the first time. But things have changed in the series. She took Frank's gun without his knowledge or consent, and we know that eventually she's going to have to face the reality of shooting someone with it. But will it be a bandit or an infected that she shoots first? Anyway, they're probably heading to Pittsburgh next, since it's on the way to Kansas City, and we might see the series get back to the game's version of events, unless they take the Lake Erie route, which I kind of want them to. Imagine the look on Ellie's face when she sees a huge lake for the first time in her life, and Joel could probably tell her some fun facts about when and how he visited the place 20 years ago. And imagine if she asks him who he went with, and he isn't able to answer because it was Sarah. I'd love to see that. And I know that it means they won't go to Pittsburgh like in the game. But hey, Buffalo and Cleveland are literally right next to Lake Erie, so that should work, right? Anywho, this finally brings us to Bill's letter for Joel, which foreshadows his journey through the series. The scene with the letter was just perfect, in my opinion. Raw emotion with a dash of Ellie's humor, just how I like it. In the letter, Bill tells Joel that he's probably the only person who'll understand how it feels to hate the world and be happy that everyone's dead. But he says that he was wrong to think that, because he found the one person worth saving. People like Bill and Joel, they're hardcore survivors who were put on the earth to save that someone. Now, at the time of writing the letter, Bill had no idea whether Tess was alive or not, but he hoped that she was, because Joel was with her. So he was confident when he said that Joel should continue protecting Tess for as long as he can. And that's where Joel had to excuse himself, because he couldn't live with his failure. But he also accepts Bill's promise and realizes that he's now meant to protect Ellie and to keep her safe.
I just finished making a truck battery. It's charging right now.
Okay.
I have a brother out in Wyoming. He's in some kind of trouble, and I'm heading out there to find him.
No matter what the cost, that's his purpose. Just like Bill's purpose was to love and protect Frank until the day they died. And that's what Joel will do in the end. Oh, and before I end the video, here's a fun fact. Remember the 80s music in the first episode that warns Tess and Joel? Yeah, it wasn't a warning. Bill and Frank had been dead for weeks. Fun, right? And that's it, folks. I'll see you in the next one.